Hi everyone, my name is Sharon and I'm a lecturer in applied psychology in University College Cork, and I've been asked to come today to talk to you a little bit about trauma and how that affects people in different ways. So let's start off by talking about what do I mean when I say trauma. Trauma is where an individual finds it very difficult to integrate their experience into their emotions and their behaviour. So something really bad happens and they find it's just so overwhelming that they can't integrate that into themselves. People respond differently, so we all have a different capacity to deal with different issues at different times. So you and I might experience the same event and one of us might be more impacted than the other. And that is to do with, how we were around the day, have we got any other stressors going on? So sometimes people say, well, what do you mean when you're talking about a trauma? What exactly is that? So there are lots of different types of experiences and events that can happen that some people can experience as traumas, others might not. But I suppose let's focus in a little bit. If we think about the situation in Ukraine, let's create a scenario where we can, refine some of those ideas. So if you imagine that a woman arrives here in Ireland and she's seeking refuge, and her name is Maria, she has just fled a war. That is a traumatic experience. She may have seen horrific events and she may experience that as a trauma. Unfortunately, for many people who experience traumas in adulthood, it might not be the only trauma that they've experienced. So if we imagine Maria as a child and we think about that Maria was involved in a very serious road accident as a child and one of her parents died in that accident. So not only is she arriving here fleeing the trauma of war, she's also carrying a trauma burden from another time in her life. So trauma is not as simple as just a single incident event. Sometimes it is, but actually for many people, they can experience multiple traumas throughout their lifetime. And unfortunately, that's not uncommon. We know, for example, that about 12.5% of people living in Ireland have experienced at least one trauma themselves as a child, whether that was exposure to domestic violence, living with a parent who was unwell, some type of abuse and neglect. One of the things that you will be very familiar with, of course, is most people have heard of the term post-traumatic stress disorder. That's quite a common term that's used in relation to trauma, and that does apply very much so to those single incident one-off events and to people who are fleeing war. Not everybody who experiences these events become traumatized, but a significant amount of people do. And that's why you will hear the term PTSD or post-traumatic stress. So people can adopt particular behaviours or responses as a result of having post-traumatic stress disorder, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. So what happens to us when we are frightened, when we are stressed, and we are traumatised? Well, our brain is really, really clever. And it does lots and lots of things in order to keep us safe. So one of the things that happens is it activates our fight, flight or freeze response, and you will have heard of that. I'm going to talk to you for a minute about our brain, because our brain is wonderfully clever at making sure that we're safe. So I like to think about it in terms of having our front brain. So that's the part of our brain that deals with our thinking, learning, planning ahead. At the back of our brain, we have what we call the old brain. So this is the part of the brain that scans the environment for threat. And I'm going to give you an example. So if I'm driving down along the road, my middle brain is constantly scanning the environment. And if it perceives a threat, it will react. And how it does that is it triggers my fight or flight response system. And in order for my fight or flight response system to work really well, I need to have less thinking. The one thing you cannot do in an emergency is think, because you waste too much time and you put yourself in more danger. And our brain knows this. So what it does is it reduces the activity in our front brain so that our fight or flight response system can activate itself and work more efficiently. So we either go into fight mode, or we go into flight mode and we disappear and we run away, or we freeze. So if you take the example of driving down the road in your car and somebody pulls out in front of you, your brain notices that, it reacts. Do you curse before or after you've slammed on the brakes? It's nearly always afterwards, because your thinking brain goes offline, your body jumps into action, it slams on that brake, and then your thinking brain comes back online again. You say, oh my goodness, that was a close call. we operate with those systems every single day. If they did not work properly, we would get hurt if we tried to cross the road, because our brain wouldn't be checking for danger and it wouldn't be kicking in to activate when we're in danger. Unfortunately, for people who've experienced a lot of trauma or stress, and if you take war as an example, what can happen is the fight or flight response mode becomes very, very sensitive, and it might be turned on at times when there's absolutely no danger at all. So what are the kind of things that happen if your fight or flight response mode is activated and there's no danger? So for example, you can have communication difficulties. So somebody's talking to you, and while they understand the words that you're saying, they're actually finding it really difficult to interpret that information because that front brain is gone offline. Another thing that can happen is if somebody is totally overwhelmed by the amount of stress or trauma that they've experienced, the brain and the body might say, actually, we're not able to cope with any more stress because it is just too much. So there can be a difficulty then in terms of being able to manage grief. So what can happen is sometimes you might meet somebody who's experienced something horrific and you say, oh, they seem not emotional, and I thought they were going to be upset about that situation, when actually they seem totally blank and non-responsive. And that is the brain and the body kicking in to say, this person cannot deal with not one more ounce of stress. So what I've done is I've jumped in to save them, to allow the body to try and reset and adjust. So we often have a lot of biases or our own expectations. So we imagine, oh, if this happened to me, this is how I would react. Not everybody reacts in the same way. We have not walked in the shoes of everybody that we've met. So you cannot expect a person to respond in a particular way. They may respond in a way that you are not expecting at all. And all you have to do is to take a deep breath and step back and say, that's really difficult for that person, and this is the way that they're dealing with that. I think that this image, which is about the window of tolerance, is a really good way of explaining how we all respond differently to stress and trauma. So if you think about when we're in our green space, there's some days, and that's our window of tolerance, and that's when we're doing really well. So there's some days, something stressful might happen. You're driving to work and a car pulls out in front of you and they get really cross and they're blowing the horn, but you're in a great mood, so you just wave and you think, oh my goodness, and you keep driving. On another day, you get up in the morning, you've got a couple of things that you're worried about and you're not feeling well and you haven't slept well the night before, and you're driving to work and the same scenario happens. But today, this is the straw that broke the camel's back, and you leave your window of tolerance. So some of us, when we leave our window of tolerance, we go into the red zone, which is hyperarousal. So you can become very cross and very agitated. So you start blowing the horn back and you might shout a few curse words out the window. Other people then, when they leave their window of tolerance, they can go into the blue zone, which is they become very withdrawn, very numb, slightly frozen. Both of these reactions are reactions to stress and trauma. Both of them are adaptive and normal responses to reaction to stress and trauma. It's just that some people react in different ways. So if you see somebody who's very agitated or very angry, that can be difficult to look at, and sometimes we might even feel a little bit scared. But that is not any different than the person who has gone down to their bedroom, pulled the quilt over their head, and has totally withdrawn from the world. Both of these people are having a trauma response, except they're communicating it in a different way. So if we take Maria, for example, who has arrived here and she's experienced the trauma of war, she might arrive to a counter and she might be trying to explain something that she needs, and there may be a loud bang in the background, and this might trigger a stress response. Maria may become hyper-aroused if that's her normal way of responding to stress or trauma, and she may become angry. And people will look and say, oh my goodness, she's very angry, she's very agitated. She's not. She's actually really frightened. And how her body wants her to react to that, to keep her safe, is to bring in the defense mechanism of anger. Maria may also become very hypo-aroused, so she might seem very shut down. And you might say, oh, she's not very grateful. She hasn't said please and thank you. She hasn't smiled. She hasn't engaged with me emotionally. And it's because her body has shut down her emotion so that she doesn't become too stressed and overwhelmed with what has just happened. So now we've talked about trauma, let's talk about some of the things that we can do. So if you think about Maria for a moment, and let's imagine we're in a room with Maria and there's a loud bang, something falls off the table. that doesn't have any impact on most of us. But for somebody who's just come from war, or for people who've experienced domestic violence, for example, that loud bang can trigger a stress response. So what can we do? The first thing that we do is we mind ourselves and notice ourselves, because lots of us have experienced trauma too. So when you're in the presence of somebody who gets very upset or emotional or stressed or angry, it can bring up a trauma response in us. If our heart starts to race and we leave our front brain, we're not going to be able to help in that moment. So you ground yourself, feel your feet on the floor, take a deep breath. Once you've sorted yourself out, now you can help. So have a look around in the environment. Is there any loud noises that need to be removed? Are there children running in and out, making loads of noise? What's going on around that could be removed very easily to make the place feel calmer, more relaxed, and a little bit safer? Next, let's try to deflect from the situation. We never ask anybody about their experiences of trauma. What we do is we try to bring them to a safe place. So what you can do is you can say, can I make you a cup of tea? So the simple act of drinking a cup of tea means you have to concentrate. Is the drink hot? Am I going to spill it on myself? That helps to give a little bit of relief in the moment, to take somebody out of that memory that they've just had, so they can bring them back to, we're here, we're okay, everything's all right. During all of this, it's really important that we keep a nice, calm, safe voice. And even if we feel stressed and a little bit worried, we might even feel annoyed. Sometimes we can feel annoyed when somebody gets angry. But if we can concentrate on the fact that for some people, when they feel unsafe, their trauma response looks awkward, uncomfortable, and difficult. And we just notice that and make it as safe as we possibly can so that that moment can pass. I've given an example there of when somebody leaves their window of tolerance and they go into the red zone and they get very angry. And of course, we can't forget that some people can become very withdrawn. I've often heard people saying that they're supporting somebody who's going through a very difficult time, and they might say, you know, I was a bit disappointed that they seemed a bit ungrateful, or they were not very motivated. And one of the things that we do when we're helping is, and one of the things that's good for us when we're helping, is that when we get feedback, that's just always really nice. But unfortunately, there are lots of people who've experienced trauma where they go into that blue zone. They become very numb. We might expect them to be emotional. We might expect them to be upset. We might expect them to be grateful. We might expect them to be motivated, but they're none of those things. We can get frustrated then and say, well, I'm doing all of this and they're still in bed or they're not getting up. And you have to remember that that might be that person's trauma response. This is the only way they're able to manage their emotions at the moment.